Tonight, I'd like to just talk a little bit about mercy. I don't remember who was speaking last week, but I just remembered, I just jotted it down. I wanted to come back, talk about more about this. And by mercy, I mean, first of all, compassion. It's probably the more common word you find in Buddhism. It's compassion. And that refers to a quality of tenderheartedness with suffering, your own or someone else's. Usually it's talked about as someone else's, but certainly applies to your own. But I like the word mercy because it has this kind of dual meaning. It means compassion, but it also it means this quality of not judging people, not condemning people when their behavior is less than optimal. Sort of like granting the mercy, if you think about like the king or the judge, we talk about that. But I mean it in a more general way. It's like we cut people some slack. And for me, the word, it captures something about the difficulty of being a human being. It's very complicated to be a human being. It's not easy, in case you haven't noticed. And it takes a long time to grow up as a human being. In fact, I think in some respects, there are places inside of us that we never grow up from. We never quite mature. There are little kind of glitches in each of us that fill that. Human beings are not perfect by any means. And we're like constantly, we have to manage so many different levels. The psyche has so many different levels, from just like the physical, like how we're managing how tired we are or how hungry we are, that whole kind of food thing. And just like on a basic level of, being hungry affects you versus having just eaten affects you too, can make you sleepy or whatever, the whole kind of digestive thing. And there's the sleep thing. There's the, all the different kind of interpersonal things that are going on among people, different kinds of attractions, different kinds of, power kinds of things, of negotiating, getting what you want, getting what you need, making sure everybody around you is okay. We're just kind of negotiating a lot there. And then there's what we bring inside from our history, the kind of tender places, the sore places. That's maybe another use of the word tender. The places that are kind of sore inside of us that keep getting touched by experiences of life, and often are touched, in our most intimate relationships. So we're kind of negotiating that as well, all of the kind of history that we bring and all of the projection, expectation of the future that we bring as human beings. I think we have so much more of that than other animals because we have these incredibly symbolic sort of minds that project future so well. So we're living in these complicated inner worlds with all these sorts of interpretations. How do we interpret that? How do we interpret what just happened, what someone just said? What framework do we put it in? What kind of expectation? Or so, we're negotiating that, and even just, the emotional fluctuations of a day. I mean, apart from being specifically triggered by something, there's just things that you go through. I went through a little kind of dip in my mood today around feeling sore, in my hip. My right hip is kind of a chronic tendinitis to it, and once in a while it kind of gets me down. So there's this kind of dip, and then things happen, and there's kind of come back up. So we've got these sort of fluctuating things. It's so complicated to be a human being, and then there's this general human tendency to be kind of self-absorbed, if I can put it that way, seeing things from your own perspective, having a hard time getting out of your own perspective to see someone else's perspective. So all these things are kind of going on, and we've negotiated these things for however many years of life we've had, and it's always imperfect. And so mercy just is this quality of presence, I would say, a quality of heart, which allows for that, which sees the difficulty of ourselves and other human beings as they negotiate things in their lives, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. And when there's this quality of mercy inside, there's just an ability to recover, shall we say, from whether it's offending someone or ignoring someone or making the wrong choice of what to do, which may have left you like one of your needs unmet, or just, we all know this. And so to have that, to offer that to ourselves and to offer to other people, it's such a marvelous gift. Part of the reason this is on my mind is I read an article about Pope Francis this week in a magazine, and it was a reflection back on his papacy and kind of what he brought to it, and it used the word mercy, which was a favorite word of his, and the way that he wanted to lead the church in such a way, the Catholic Church in such a way, that there was room for people to be people, and for a quality of mercy to be at the heart of things. So that kind of, stimulated me, even just reading his kind of reflections as a leader of a spiritual tradition. Mercy was a very important word to him. In the Buddhist tradition, I think we don't use that word. We tend to use compassion. But again, words, they have their feeling to them. And this word has a particular kind of feeling tone to me that I find useful. So one of the things that I would suggest you do this week, as a result just of taking this class, I usually give a little bit of homework. And, last week we talked about speech, and I look forward to hearing kind of where that went with you and your week when we have the dialogue. But you might examine this coming week just how you are with your own suffering and other people's suffering. And the way that I find this useful to work with is there's a kind of a meditation bell that can go off when someone annoys you or you're annoyed with yourself. Either thing, you can think of it as like a meditation bell. Time to pay attention. This is time to pay attention. And the framework with which I would encourage you to pay attention is that of suffering. When you're around somebody who's behaving in a difficult way, there are various frames of reference for understanding that. Some of them, I think, are more skillful than others. But the one that I think is the most helpful is this is suffering. To see it as suffering. To see whatever the behavior is as arising out of suffering. I was recently around a group of, I wasn't really sure about their ages, but I think they were middle schoolers, and it's really enlightening sometimes to listen to middle schoolers talk and interact with each other. And, you kind of see the maturity level of it. And the, the level of kind of wanting to get attention and yet being kind of self-absorbed and not and kind of bouncing off each other, not necessarily meeting. It was a really curious thing. This happened to be like three boys, and so that kind of gives it a certain kind of flavor. And yet there was something dear about it, even though at the same time I could kind of see, wow, this is a very kind of not very skillful. Well, if you're in middle school, it's probably very skillful because it's where everybody else is at. You're kind of bouncing off each other, not quite meeting. But I could feel how much they wanted to like be of importance to each other. You could kind of feel the social need that was bonding them together, even as there was kind of in a certain way, not quite meeting, at least in the way I as an adult would want to in terms of a conversation or what's said. And I could feel the suffering of it. And I mean that word suffering not in a really heavy way. I think they were in their own way having a good time. They were like together, and they were, stimulating each other. There was, I think it was a good thing. And yet I could also feel the awkwardness of it and the needs that were present. That's what I mean by suffering. Not necessarily that it's always a bad thing, but we human beings are trying to negotiate this human thing, and that is a particularly awkward age, and where suddenly your peers and your social life becomes monumentally important, and yet you're not necessarily so skilled in how to negotiate that. It's the nature of that age. And it's not, is not necessarily anything that we want to hold against them at that age. And I imagine, I'm not around it much, it wasn't annoying to me, but I can imagine that it can be really annoying if you're their parent, or you're the parent who has a group of them over at your house. It can be trying, shall we say. So, along with everything else that you might try to do to steer them in the right direction and so forth, just on a certain level, just contemplate their suffering. If you can understand the word the way I mean it, each time I say it, sometimes we think of suffering as someone in pain, someone like in agony. No, it's actually just the unsatisfactory nature of the human condition coming out, and, sometimes you can be at a party and there's this awkwardness if you don't know anyone. And I don't want to use the word suffering like, oh, it's just totally miserable. But you can understand there's difficulty there. And that's the human thing. And that's what I mean by bringing mercy, bringing tenderness, just to the perspective. It doesn't get you out of doing whatever you have to do in terms of negotiating life with people, but it does soften things a bit. And I think it puts things in proper perspective that, suffering. And then similarly inside of yourself, suffering can be a softening word, So I sometimes encourage people to use this phrase, which is really very common in the Buddhist suttas. This is suffering, just to describe one's current experience. And it's rather generic and covers a lot of ground. So it's not just this is suffering when you're miserable or when you're in pain, but it's also suffering when you're impatient, or you're confused, or there's a moment where you don't know what to do. Um, have you ever noticed those sorts of moments where that are in between? And there's an interesting moment where I sometimes decide not to do anything productive, you know, not to do anything useful. And then there's this awkward kind of moment. It's like, so what do I do now? You know? So life tends to be so programmed and so like driven by what needs to happen next. But sometimes there's this little, there's this little insecurity to, wow, what if I just try to figure out what I need and what I want in this moment? And there's often a little suffering to that. There's just a little kind of not knowing quite what to do when I'm in a transition from the get her done mode to maybe I don't need to get anything done right now mode. That too is suffering. And so as you're with yourself through the day, as you see the moments of difficulty, you can say, this is suffering. It feels a little different than I'm suffering. I'm suffering has this tendency to drag you deeper in a certain way, in an unhelpful way, because suddenly I am in the middle of it, and you're taking it personally. Whereas this is suffering, it has this quality of contemplation to it, and recognition, and acknowledgement of what this is. And so I find it easier to use that phrase and have it kind of produce this little softening inside. This little tenderness is possible because suffering has been acknowledged and not judged. From an egoic perspective, egos think they're always supposed to have the solution to things. Egos think they're always supposed to, be on top of things and be in control. And it's such a relief to acknowledge suffering and to not have the ego come in and have to fix it, do something about it, make it okay. It can be just okay that life is this way. It doesn't have to be improved upon. It can be just seen, oh, that's suffering. That's not to say that you can learn greater skillfulness and avoid a lot of suffering. There's a lot of that sort of teaching, and certainly I do that sort of teaching. But on just a really, really basic level, just acknowledging suffering when it's happening is so helpful, whether it's in yourself or in someone else. Another example that comes to mind is, sometimes I'm in a conversation with my wife and she's unhappy about something. Maybe it's something about me. Maybe it's something I've done or haven't done. And it's so helpful when I can notice my own suffering. There's this sort of cringe, maybe call it, and maybe a tendency to want to defend myself, kind of rearing up. And so see that as suffering, but then to turn to her and see whatever she's saying as suffering. And that's really quite liberating because it kind of tends to get me out of the I'm the cause of her suffering idea, which might even be her idea. But in that moment when I see that she's suffering, I can genuinely say, oh, I'm sorry you're suffering. I'm sorry this is hard for you. And for the moment, I'm not engaging with defending myself. I'm also not necessarily believing her perceptions either. But I'm staying with the simplest level of truth, which is she's suffering and she's telling me about it. And it happens to have my name in it, in the story of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything yet. There can be a later moment when it's important for me to acknowledge my role, and take responsibility where that needs to be taken. But these kind of conversations and how they go. And so the most immediate thing is like, I want to like insert my perception, my perspective. I want to kind of jump in there. And of course, there's a kind of defensive urge to that. So rather than do that, to like just acknowledge, oh, this is suffering. It's hard for me actually to be in the presence of this right now. And that just creates space to be there. And then to notice she's suffering. And on that just really basic level, it takes tons of the difficulty out of the whole discussion. Just those two moments. So see where you might find similar sorts of moments in your life this week, where just having a heart of mercy and seeing suffering for what it is the solution. It's all you have to remember to do. And then I think other things flow quite naturally from it.